Okay, so I teach courses in mathematics education, which are largely assessed through essays. But most of my students are mathematicians who haven't written an essay since high school. They find academic writing difficult and unfamiliar, and they often try to avoid it, leaving it until the night before it is due. Now, colleagues in my department and in my faculty have told me similar stories about their postgraduate students. Students who topped their classes in undergrad, in mathematics and in science, struggle when it comes to writing 30-page dissertations. They spend the year doing the maths, the science, the stuff that they're familiar with, the stuff that they're comfortable with, the lab experiments, the fieldwork, basically anything they can do to avoid having to actually start writing. And of course, this isn't just particular to mathematics and science. There are students across the whole university who are avoiding writing. But I think there's something particular about the way we regard writing in our discipline, definitely in mathematics and possibly also in science, that makes this problem more acute for us. We often marginalize mathematics, sorry, not mathematics, we certainly don't marginalize mathematics. We marginalize writing to the borders of our intellectual activity. Writing, we say, is not our core work. Our core work is to do mathematics. We only write once we have something that we think is worth sharing. Let's see. So we regard writing and mathematics as these completely separate entities. And yet, we mathematicians are expected to write. We're assessed on our academic writing by thesis examiners, by journal editors, by Marsden grant review panels. But because we don't really prioritize it, we don't really know how to teach it. And we probably communicate some of our own anxieties and some of our own avoidant behaviors onto our students. So my goal for this year was to learn how to teach academic writing to mathematicians. But I went about this back to front and decided to start seeing if I could teach calculus to poets. Not just any calculus, the fundamental theorem of calculus. Now, I knew I could not start with this statement. Instead, what we did was we started with some familiar embodied experiences, like going down water slides, we talked about tramping tracks, and through that, we developed some precise mathematical notions of gradients and limits and areas under curves and tangent lines and things like that. I couldn't stop my writers from doing natural writerly things, like discussing the etymology of these mathematical terms, or writing spontaneous found poems about limits and integrals and infinitesimals. But we kept linking these writerly experiences to mathematical ones. And by the end of it, they had a pretty decent working understanding of the fundamental theorem of calculus. Now, I have a second identity as a student of writing in this university. And for some time now, I've been crossing the road, taking these furtive courses in the English department. And during my studies, I came across a statement. It says, writing is a technology that restructures thought. This was pretty challenging for me. It suggests that writing is not some inert, passive medium that we use to convey these preformed thoughts. Instead, writing actually acts on our thinking. It changes our thinking. It restructures our thinking. But this idea is also quite liberating. It means that we don't have to wait until we've got some perfect idea that we completely understand first before we start writing. We can start writing reassured in the knowledge that as we write, the writing itself will help develop our understandings. So scholars in the humanities and the arts and the social sciences, they work by this idea. They write as a method of discovery. And I realized that in my fellowship year, this is what I wanted to be teaching my students. But how? How do I go about teaching something like this to a group of mathematicians? I couldn't just give them that academic text. It's a very, very dense, heavy academic text. I had to start with some kind of familiar experiences that were familiar to my mathematicians. And at this point, one of my writing mentors, Sean, suggested that I use mathematical metaphors. So let's have a refresher course on what a mathematical metaphor is. So when the great Simon and Garfunkel sang, "I am a rock, I am an island," they were exploiting our familiarity with these mundane objects, rocks and islands, to talk about the singer's I. So in cognitive science, a metaphor is actually a mapping across two conceptual domains. So we have a conceptual domain here. This is our target domain, the I. This is what Simon and Garfunkel were trying to convey to us. But in order to convey that I, they utilized or exploited our source domain, our knowledge of rocks, our knowledge that rocks are strong and hard and unemotional. And by creating this mapping from the source domain to the target domain, through this very simple metaphor, I am a rock, they got all of those ideas for free. We have this idea that the singer's I is hard, strong, unemotional. Okay, so when Sean was saying, "Can you find a mathematical metaphor for writing?" what he was really saying was, can you exploit your mathematics students' familiarity with their discipline, with mathematics, to smuggle in or to introduce some ideas about writing? I thought that was brilliant, so I set to work. Now, the first metaphor came quite easily, and that was because I was really concerned that my students just weren't even starting writing. So the first thing I wanted them to do was get some idea about what it means to draft, how the process of drafting works, and the value of having a very, very bad first draft. In mathematical modeling, one of the things that we do is we try to understand a real-world situation by describing that in some mathematical language. So the situation we might be trying to understand could be the impact of vaccinations on the spread of influenza. Now, mathematical modelers don't spend all the time just going to clinical labs and looking at people inject people with flu vaccinations. The first thing they do is to try and model that situation. They'll come up with a set of equations, they'll test it out, they'll run the model and see if it works. They start with a bad first draft, knowing that that bad first draft is a very productive way in to the ideas. So in modeling, perfection is actually irrelevant. It's not a useful ideal at all. A good model is one that distorts the real-world situation. In fact, if a model was perfect, then it wouldn't be a model. It would be the real situation. So perfection is a completely useless ideal in modeling, and I wanted to get that same message across to my students. One of the ways I did this was by giving them 10 minutes of free writing in class, saying, just write something down. Just start creating something, turn off your internal critic for a while, just for 10 minutes, and at the end, see what you've got. Some of my students said, far out, that was the best writing I've ever produced. And I thought, crap, that's terrible. So my next problem was, once I get my students to create something, a bad first draft, how do I get them to craft it? How do I get them to structure their argument so that they have something coherent, something shareable? What I really wanted them to do was approach writing as an analytical tool. And this is where mathematicians excel. We spend most of our time being stuck. In fact, some people say that the state of stuckness is the natural and actually an honourable state for the mathematician. In fact, so we are so stuck that we have lots of strategies for trying to get unstuck, most of which involve holding a pen in your hand. So open the door of any mathematician's office, and if they're working on mathematics, you'll usually find him or her with a pen in their hand or at their computer. So we have things like, we say, if you're really stuck, why don't you try and work backwards? Start with where you're trying to go and work backwards. Maybe draw a diagram. Maybe look for a similar problem, or try and solve a smaller problem first. All of these ideas can carry through with that analytical process of writing. In fact, I have heard mathematicians in departmental meetings, when we've been lobbying for more building space, say, the whiteboard is our laboratory. Okay? That's where we test out our ideas. That's where we figure out what we understand. Writing is a tool that we use in our mathematics. And if we don't use that same tool when we're stuck in our writing, we're denying ourselves our own laboratory. We're denying ourselves our own thinking tools. So I got my students creating more writing, and I got them crafting a little bit. But they were really reluctant to show their writing to anybody at all, still. And I found that, just as Marie McEntee has already said, that notion of your writing, it's not just something that you do for yourself. It's something that seeks to address an audience. It has to convince, it has to persuade. So what's something that we do in mathematics? Well, we do a lot of proving in mathematics. And in mathematics, as we prove, one of the things that we do is we seek out willing guinea pigs who will listen to us. We say, look, I've got this proof, can I try it out on you? And we'll tell it to somebody, and they might say, look, I really don't understand what you're saying from step 2 to step 3. And we don't tell them, well, that's because you're an idiot. We say, oh, actually, thank you, that's really helpful. I think I'm going to have to go back and try and work that little bit out. Or we might say, oh, really? I thought that was obvious. What I was trying to say was blah, 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 blah. Now, the exact same thing happens in writing. When we seek out peer critiques of people who are readers of our writing, they can tell us the bits that don't work so well. And rather than just assuming that it's because they don't understand what we're trying to say, we can take their readerly experiences as opportunities for us to refine how we're saying things. Okay, fourth metaphor. I'm almost at the end. The fourth metaphor almost just fell into my lap. Okay, so when writing academic essays, we have the standard paragraph structure. So every standard paragraph should have one main point, then there should be evidence for that main point or that idea, there should be an explanation for that idea, and then there should be some kind of discussion of the significance of the idea. Okay, so this was kind of an artisanal thing that I was trying to teach my students in academic writing. And I realized that in mathematics, we have the exact same thing in our textbooks. We start with a theorem, which is the main point. We then give a proof of it, which is the evidence for that idea. We then might give an example of it, which is explaining that idea. And then we'll end with a corollary often. Now, a corollary is something that comes out of this theorem. It's a kind of a byproduct of the theorem. It's a useful thing that you can use that you almost get for free from that theorem. And sometimes corollaries are so useful that they deserve their own attention, that they become theorems in themselves. The same thing happens when writing paragraphs. If, when you're writing about this idea, I tell my students, you come up with an idea towards the end that is so interesting it deserves its own paragraph, for goodness sakes, please stop that paragraph there and start a new one. Now, my students really seem to really enjoy these or appreciate these metaphors, and they were a very useful way in. I got lots of good positive feedback from students and from other teachers that I was co-teaching with. And I was actually on a roll, and I thought, okay, this is working so well, coming up with all these metaphors, fantastic. I thought I'd do one final one, and this one was a difficult one. Now, in mathematics education, we often have large pieces of text that we want students to paraphrase, that we want them to make sense of, through their own experiences. We want them to link those ideas to other ideas, and we want them to write about them in their own words. It often doesn't happen. Instead, what we usually get is large pieces of quoted material from the text, if it's quoted at all. So I was talking to a colleague of mine, and we thought, well, doesn't that happen in mathematics? We have large pieces of text, we have ideas, or we have questions on assignments, and we have to try and make sense of those assignments, questions. So we interact with them, and we interact with them by adding text to the text. We don't just absorb their text without doing anything. We add things in the margins. We do this marginalia. So we thought, if we show students this, and if we give them some experiences of doing that, we might be able to make that leap. We gave them an example of some mathematics education text on a piece of paper like this, and we expected them, or we asked them, to try and fill the margins with their ideas. It worked reasonably well, actually. We did see quite a lot in there. And so I was going to chalk it up to another success, but we decided to give an informal questionnaire about how the course was going to our students. We asked them 3 questions. We said, what should we continue doing, what should we stop doing, and what should we start doing? And I got this back from one student. One thing we should stop doing, spending too much time on unnecessary stuff, etc., e.g. how to read a book, how to play around with an error. Say 30 minutes on such content is way too much. That was pretty gutting. I was a bit disappointed about that and a bit indignant. But then I started thinking, this is actually a gem. This is a really great opportunity for me to theorize and reflect on what went wrong. Why do some metaphors work, and why do other metaphors not work? And in this case, what I think we had done is we had assumed too much about the student's familiarity with the source domain. It turns out not all mathematics students will get an assignment and immediately start writing text on it. A lot of them just leave it until the last minute and then crib off their peers. Another thing that we had done wrong is that we hadn't problematized it enough. So we had ignored this necessity principle, the need for this, for the why, which is what Marie was talking about. We assumed that students would think, oh, well, that's great. Obviously, I need to learn how to interpret a text and talk about it in my own words. But it didn't happen. So I could have stopped at that 4th metaphor and chalked this up to a series of successes. But I wanted to talk and share this failure with you for a couple of reasons. One is because it helps us theorize about the interventions. And I want to say that again. So in education, or in this university, there is so much emphasis on results that when we talk about teaching innovations, we're often really reluctant to talk about any results that aren't brilliant successes. And that's not good, for lots of reasons. But one reason is that interventions are not the only types of results in education. They're good results in education when they work well, but they're not the only one. Theoretical understandings of why those interventions work or don't work are another type of result. And if we don't reflect on things that go well and go badly, and let's be honest, we often reflect more on the things that don't go well than the things that do, then we don't do as much theorizing about those interventions. So it was through those interventions that we started developing principles. So if you're going to use discipline-based metaphors for writing in your own work, fantastic. But here are 3 principles that we came up with when reflecting on what works and why. First one, the contextualization principle. Establish your students' disciplinary familiarity, especially at the undergraduate level. The second is the necessity principle. Provide early and significant experience of struggle with your students. And then the third one is the consolidation principle, which is provide immediate and clear opportunities for students to practice those ideas. I hope these ideas have been useful for some of the mathematicians in the audience, but I hope the principles might carry through to more of you in the audience as you seek to develop your own discipline-based metaphors for writing. Thank you.